talking today about our project, The Lovers, and how we're exploring gender through Midsummer through the lovers that are in it, and the different experiences that they have as they become bewitched, or they fall in love with different people as it goes through. We had an amazing week last week, and it's really directly fed in to the process. We're talking about the sexuality of the characters, tying us absolutely up in knots in terms of like definitions and binaries and stereotypes, but it was amazing and really, really helpful, and hopefully we can kind of go deeper into that. So we've got Ed, would you like to give us just like a short rundown?
To me? Okay, hello everyone, my name's Ed. Hello. Hello. I'm a trustee and volunteer with Brighton, which is an LGBT mental health organisation, and I also run a peer support group in Brighton. They're a trans peer support group here in Brighton as well.
I'm Sam Carroll. I work at the University of Brighton, and I'm on the management committee of Queen's Park Books. We produce Brighton Transformed book, which I co-edited.
Hi, I'm Phoenix. I am a queer costume designer. I'm researching queer and costume design at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, and I am also a local LGBT activist. I am on the committee for Trans Pride Brighton, and also the Brighton Trans Alliance, and possibly FTM Brighton. And I also work for the LGBT Health and Inclusion Project, which is part of...
Yeah. Sorry, I moved.
Which is part of Brighton and Hove LGBT.
Oh, that's great.
So that's me.
And Patrick with the food.
Hi, I'm Pat. I'm a writer. I'm part of a collective in London called the Arcola Queer Collective, and we put on a queer version of Midsummer's Night Dream, which just found out about, and asked me to come down and talk here. Yeah, so it's lovely to be here and lovely to meet you all.
Oh, thanks so much. Feel free to move between the tables. Feel free to turn over the cards and reveal another question. So the way the system works is the cards are face down on the tables, they're turned over to reveal the question and then turned back, so that people are then free to reveal a new question and to move the discussion along in a non-aggressive, non-interruptive sort of way. By drinks, by food, it's all very relaxed. Thanks so much for being here, guys. We're going to talk for about 20-25 minutes and then have a break so people can order food and then come down.
Okay. You guys are pretty au fait with what we're doing already from last week. Should we go through that again? So we'll sort of work our way through different questions. We might sort of ask each other's opinions. We could sort of move the conversation in different ways. If we'd like to perhaps try and explore a different avenue of inquiry, then we can turn over another card and start looking at something new. So, does someone want to get us started and turn over a card?
Yeah. What is your behaviour?
How real are those? Is it those?
How real are those feelings?
Yeah.
Okay. So I wrote that card, and I guess what I'm interested in hearing people's thoughts about is how is the idea of reality and the reality of that desire of those relationships in the context of the performance, but also in the context of the enchantment in the text. I think it's quite interesting, especially in relation to queer sexualities and queer orientations. Because a lot of the time there are discourses surrounding queer sexualities which try to negate those sexualities and those intimacies and relationships by delegitimising them. So, in a sense, I guess what I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on is how real are those relationships between those characters? How much investment do we have in their legitimacy, as it were, at different points in the performance?
Today actually we were looking at the third act for the sections we've got. It's very much just cut to pretty much all of the lover scenes, with the exception of sitting and watching the play at the end.
Is that over in Titania gone?
Kind of, yes. I mean, at the moment it's all a bit up in the air in terms of how much we're using.
How have you picked the genders?
So
Lysander and Demetrius.
So Hermia
is now
Theodore, which is the character that I play.
Lysander is Anthony, and then Demetrius is Elizabeth, and then Helena is Helena.
Okay.
So, I think she has to change the names for I think it was just for.
I think she just wanted real
it's a bit distancing sometimes, like Lysander. We talked about it today because at the very beginning, the kind of the legit relationship is Theodore, so Lysander and Hermia, and they are intending to get married. That's kind of. The assumption is they've either been together for a long time, or they've got to a point obviously where this is enough. It's
definitely. In terms of like how real are these feelings, like the first thing I thought about when that came out, because what was most difficult for us putting it together was that Demetrius is the only one still under the power of the flower at the end.
That's what we're trying to deal with today.
Yeah.
So that's I think that's quite in terms of drug use and how that can influence or give a false sense of connection or intimacy, emotional intimacy.
But is it a false sense of connection? Is it perhaps just
because it's supposed to be transient, isn't it? But like if it's permanent drug use, then I guess you're permanently changed. So
connection is transient. Maybe connection is momentary.
And you just have reconnections.
It could entirely be, but I don't think that's what Shakespeare is aiming for in the text. But maybe you want to subvert this idea of true love. That A Midsummer Dream is trying to put forward. We didn't want to completely just go blindly along with Love Is Blind, kind of thing.
So I'm like,
I think also for Helena, being so incredibly, infatuated, there could be like a lack of reality there, because you get infatuated with somebody, don't you? Like you can, I know in my house, you get obsessively infatuated with someone, not really knowing them, right? But because that spark, exactly. So that's not, So that's, I think that's. So what are we trying to aim for with the questions? Just general, just open-ended.
Just a bit more. Just examining kind of theatre and art and representations in the media and things, rather than a kind of, sometimes things can get too broad just into things when you say like people's experiences, blah, but kind of relating it back as you're doing, to your work.
Whoever's playing Helena. I think there could be a great deal of irreality about that obsession of love. And it could be from because we don't know much about her background, but she's had some kind of some external influences upon her. have come from childhood, adolescence, you know, and then you latch on to somebody who's going to be your saviour.
But then, how do we know? How do we know then that that's legitimate? I'm trying to recall how the genders are. Which genders are switched again in the production?
So, Lysander and Hermia, so the couple who are going to run off to get married, are Michael and John, and then Demetrius and Helena are Elizabeth and Helena. I think because we found today that at the end, when we were having a go at the last scene, when they wake up, and like you said, Elizabeth, Demetrius, Elizabeth is still under the spell, and how completely ridiculous that feels in that moment. Because Marie had a really good point that in the other when it's Demetrius and a male and Lysander, it's almost like men winning their prizes. How it feels because they fight for. I think they even say at some point,
if people aren't engaging,
win my prize,
kind of be in the discussions,
Helena, or something that then switched really kind of.
In the beginning, you know, with Aegeus, you know, being like, she is my property to give away. You've got that kind of the patriarchal idea of having power over property. But that's a really interesting point too.
Did you find as you sort of like blasted away from the text in certain areas, it then became hard to kind of know what to cling to and how to set it and how to kind of that negotiation?
Well, I mean, I don't want to distract too much from the question. How we went about it was kind of I guess did like this, you know, like not quite with the questions thing, but like just sat around and like talked about like what it meant to us, like being queer in London in 2015, and then had some pointers such as we wanted to concentrate on parental pressures, you know, because of Aegeus saying that you can't be with your true love, etc. And we made Hermia into Hermia and Lysander into girls, and then Helena and Demetrius were boys. And we talk about unrequited love with the idea of Helena chasing after Demetrius, and talk about drug use as well. So we kept everyone into Tanya because we thought that kind of fitted into getting them to use Cairns in London right now, and try to explore those situations. And so my job, I guess, was like once all that had been just transcribed, which took ages, but actually was quite useful because then you can listen to it back and really listen to it because you have to type it out as well. And then I had to pare down Shakespeare's script on this side and just try to discern nuances within the characters. So there's one point where Demetrius says, "I'm sick when I do look and and we talk about health and well-being as well. That was another. He goes, "I'm sick when I do look and to Helena," and so from that I was like, what if Demetrius was HIV positive and self-hating because of that, and actually trying to protect Helena because he was hating himself because of his HIV status. So that was how I dealt, to answer your question, that's how I try to relate the issues back to modern day issues back to the
kind of find almost metaphors within the Shakespeare to kind of relate,
I don't know if that's helpful at all, but
yeah, it is.
I think also a big part of queer culture historically has been, because queer identities and queer cultures, you know, are more liminal and marginalised. A lot of the time, queer folk are left in a position where, in order to engage with culture, there's a sense of something that I don't know if any of you know Jose Spamignos is a queer theory writer, writes performance. Really recommend his work, but he writes about this idea of disidentification, which is the idea of reading a text, and reading is something which is very key in a lot of queer culture, is reading a text and then identifying with it in some ways, but also finding queer subtexts within that text. And I think that's a very queer practice.
There's nuances.
Yeah. And really, it's not necessarily about whether the author originally intended them to be there. It's about one's agency and engaging with the text and finding that there.
Have you seen The Celluloid Closet, which is a film made on a book by Theodore and Anthony?
Yeah. No, I've seen the...
Oh, you've seen it, yeah. And when you're talking, so it's about queer representation on screen since the beginning of cinema, essentially. And there's a line in it that what you were saying just there reminded me of where this woman says that you'll watch one film like the whole way through just to see Betty Davis come down in her black cowboy shirt because it might be a reference to her being a lesbian. Finding, going through reading the text or watching the film and discerning, a nuance within it that is somehow could relate to yourself and your identity. I think is something that's been there in queer culture for a long time.
How do you think that affects the art that comes out of queer culture? Like that kind of like waiting for a snippet or some kind of...
I think a lot of the time, in a lot of queer culture, it can go in a range of different ways, and the direction that it takes isn't always necessarily set. It might be different to different people when they're perceiving it, but some queer culture can actually appear very populist and mainstream because that's all we have to work with a lot of the time. That's the culture that we live within. That we kind of have to create some kind of bricolage. Do you know what I mean by bricolage? So sort of taking bits and pieces from different places and putting them together to make something new. So if there is nothing in culture which reflects your experience in your life, then all you have to relate to is what's there. And so it's about taking what is there, what you can see, and then sort of regurgitating it, but perhaps in a slightly weird way or a queer way. So, for example, a lot of drag queens, for example, will lip sync to very mainstream songs, and that is. Some might consider that sort of like quite an old-fashioned practice, but it's a practice which is still going on, and there are different takes on it, and different iterations of that practice. But there is a sense that queer isn't about being completely different to the mainstream. It might be a different sense of it, but it's not about sort of like looking completely different from the mainstream. It can be about taking the mainstream and doing something different with it, and finding the queer things within what's sort of normative, and then presenting them. So like you say, you're reading the lines of the text, and you're finding new interpretations of them. And so you're still doing Shakespeare, but you're finding something queer in it. And a lot of people would argue, well, Shakespeare is queer anyway, but it is canon. It is. And so I think that's definitely something to potentially be interested in and excited about is trying to find reading queer subtext into what's already there rather than creating
blatant stories.
I've never heard of that. Using the term bricolage. It just reminded me of. Do you remember when they did? It sounds like a really cheap reference, I'm afraid, but they did The Search for Nancy or whoever it was on Channel 4. And I remember Jessie Buckley singing she sang something. It was a song that was about, I can't remember, but it was singing about a woman, and it's a classic old blues song, and she sang it, and I remember watching it, and when she didn't change her to him, when she didn't do that, I remember watching it again and again, and then being like, and then going off and like singing it like that, and there being something really.
Yeah.
Because I guess I hadn't been I remember doing lots of things like that, but not being conscious of.
Yeah. I don't think that's not a cheap example at all. I think that's exactly.
But you're just like.
I think there's something happened on the X Factor, isn't it? Where there was a guy who was known to be bisexual as a contestant. And he was singing a song where there was the pronoun him, and he changed it to her, and I think Danny Minogue said something like, from what I heard, like you didn't need to change that pronoun, and there was like outrage and Danny Minogue like being homophobic, that kind of thing, but actually it's quite true. If he's there should be. I would love to hear Sam Smith, probably the most famous gay pop star, do a song that has he's out and gay. That's great, but every pronoun that's used is neutral. It's you.
It's so neutral, isn't it? Which is because for me,
like America and that kind of commercialised thing.
That is a history. That is a history of a minoritarian, of that sort of minoritarian identity and position in society, and sometimes. Actually, you do have to, try and pass under the radar, and I don't think there's any shame in owning that. Personally, I think that when you're editing the DVD cover for the Pride film, and we can talk about the politics of that film another time, or whatever, but editing it to completely remove any reference to gay pride, LGBT pride activism, I think that's tacky. But I think that I think that sometimes we are just trying to get by. Sometimes being queer isn't actually all about being queer. Yeah. Actually, our sexualities, our intimacies, our gender might be just as boring as anyone else's.
And when you're a pop star and you're singing that song, you're just playing a role and you're imagining something totally different to your own life anyway.
But if you think about empathy, we've been empathising with straight love songs for years, so surely it could work both ways. And if there was a boy singing about boy using he, that a straight married middle-aged housewife could listen to it and say, oh, I know that feeling, because it's the same feeling.
Yeah, I think the producers are more paranoid than the audience, aren't they?
Well, Nature Boy by
was it made into a programme?
No, the song.
Oh.
What, there was a boy? Is that Bowie?
Yeah. Pardon?
It's not Bowie, is it?
No. It's is it Nat King Cole or something? Originally.
Oh, okay. I don't know.
And I've always heard that as a love song myself, but it's written by a guy, and sung by a guy, sung. And so it just. It is where you find it, and it might have been put there, it might not have been put there. It is, and I think that a lot of the time when you're making something queer, there can be a real tension between. You want to be expressive, and different people have different approaches, and different pieces will have different kind of production ethoses or whatever. But you can want a production to. Sometimes you want something to look queer, and sometimes that's not a particularly queer process when it's so contrived. It's about sort of, it's still about making an image, which ultimately all performance is really. Well, I guess you could debate that, but yeah.
In terms of like, sorry, I don't want to overtake about anything, but in terms of like, you know, queer projection, what does annoy me sometimes is that what you were talking about. Sorry, excuse me. In terms of queer representation for a potential audience, and so like as a gay man, sometimes the books that come out about gay men that are like another witty comedy about how fabulous all gay men are, and it does and, you know, it does nothing to like address, you know, the internal kind of like I guess trauma isn't too over the top a word to use. It can go on from hiding yourself during your adolescence, you know, a bit the hypervigilance about being discovered, or like before you come out, and you have this great triumphant coming out, and suddenly you've been hiding yourself for 4 or 5 years as you've been developing. And of course, it's the same for all queer people. I'm not trying to hijack that just for gay men. No. But you know, that's I would like to find a novel that's kind of like deals with that rather than expunging it all and being like we're all fabulous and we're all witty and we're all, you know.
But then coming back to the idea of, you know, sort of legitimacy of reality, especially within this context, then how much of that do we invest in these representations? Because, you know, are they real, or is there that you know, that kind of that deep sense of trauma and historical an historical sense of violation almost, which I think does inform a lot of the time queer identities and queer self-representation in different ways. And so yeah, I mean, you know, how real are these attractions?
Yeah, I know, right?
But then, you know, you're starting off with 2 same-sex couplings. Yeah, how does that then affect that? I don't know. I'm just
thinking aloud.
Just thinking aloud, yeah. Yeah, I don't know.
I think there's been points where it's like we're trying to perhaps not represent everything, but try and get over as much what we've been looking at, and then being like, okay, first of all, it's an hour-long show, realistically, and then looking at the characters, it's like how much are we going to put on these characters rather than telling the stories with the gender change and taking other things like this on board, and letting that just be an aspect of it that we're showing.
And I've been letting more and more like the actors' bodies and the space kind of tell stories of gender rather than to kind of be like, this is now this scene is about this, you know, like kind of having the 4 of them lined up and they're all splitting up the text between them all, and they're all changing into different characters, they're all playing all of the characters, and so then the kind of like their natural expressions as it then changes can kind of tell as you say, like a subtext as a different thing and a different resonances as they pass through the different performers, the text goes through.
Focusing on the characters. Well, I think we were talking about it quite a bit last time we did it about what happens at what point is a gender identity decided? Do we have any reason or right to decide that for a character rather than just going, what's this character, who are they, what are they doing, and then letting I don't know. Yeah.
It's something that I've been sort of working towards in my practice, in my costume design practice, has been not wanting to associate, not wanting the costumes that I'm designing to be sort of prefigured by I do it by notions of gender. But then again, a lot of the time the way that the characters are written, they're written from a context in which gender is very important to their formulation. But what I've been trying to do in my costume design practice is to almost meditate upon not what would I think of this character, or what do I think of this character, but rather thinking sort of what is the relationship between this character and this other character, and in terms of what does the dynamic of that feel like in my body. I'm trying to think about it almost in like in an almost pre-social sense. So trying to get a feeling of what does it feel like to be. Not imagining what does it feel like for this real person in their body, but thinking from my perspective, how do I imagine it to feel like within that person's body? You know, what does it feel like physically, and how does that relate?
Such an interesting approach to it. Because that one of the biggest things that sort of can, one of the big things that can form character is those, or inform, is literally is how you are physically, where you are physically, and what So there isn't really an answer, a thing, but that I find that really interesting. That is an approach. Yeah.
But then, an important part of that for me has been to completely own my subjectivity within that process, and not to imagine this is what it's really like, but to sort of acknowledge, this is my work of art, this is my representation, and this is how. This is my feeling from the text. So, I put my body at the centre of the practice when I'm trying to, get a sense of the thing that I'm trying to represent.
Kind of like using, because I find that sometimes we've done a few times where it's sometimes it's something that you can't say, or you can't specifically point out what it is, and it's a way of representing that in a going round the corner to what am I trying to say? I can't say it right now, but that
to find a character.
Something that is kind of past words and past logic, and then trying to express that so that it's not just a concept that's living in you. If that makes sense.
And there's a lot of that in Love and Lust. What have we got on this next card?
I really can't read this.
Does drug use
sometimes transcend boundaries of intimacy?
Yeah.
But that's not the end.
If you lower your inhibitions, then you might be more intimate with somebody. But
there's also when, like with certain drugs, like coke and MDMA, there's a real frighteningly strong sense of intimacy that you can sometimes experience. That can feel a bit like those early stages of love in personal experience, but maybe don't tweet that. Do you mind?
But it's chemical, isn't it? It does trigger those chemical sensations, which you get from those those interactions with other people.
Yeah,
and it's really powerful.
I don't know if this was actually, I haven't heard about it, whether this is relevant to the show. Maybe we won't do another one, because it was something that we were touching upon, but not just because it
was definitely an idea that I explored.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was how do you get the fairies into this context? How do how do you change someone's behaviour in such a radical and immediate way? Yeah, definitely something that we looked at earlier.
Yeah, and it just touches upon like what's going on in London, like, and probably in Brighton too, like. In terms of like the chemsex phenomenon, like,
I don't know an awful lot about that.
Oh really?
Yes,
yeah. So gay men are like using methadone, G, crystal meth, in kind of like parties, chill outs, they're called, which go on for days in living rooms. It used to be in clubs, with more from the clubs into like just living rooms. And saunas.
Seriously
Sexualised, and and condoms aren't being used, so HIV rates are going soaring in really because of what's going on. And one of the theories put forward is because of what I mentioned earlier of like hiding away. You don't have hiding away your sexuality. You don't have a good boundary for intimacy because you're hiding away your sexuality from your close family. You're pretending to be straight to your mum and dad. You're pretending to be straight to your friends at school. You're pretending to be straight, pretending, and that's when your brain is formulating, your identity is formulating, and it's all to do with intertwined with your sex, and the sense of shame. So then, if you have this tool, this drug, that kind of gives you a release from that, and like says, yes, you can be horny, because all those drugs are disinhibitors, they lower your inhibitions, and that's where sex goes on. And therefore, that might be why it's so widespread. And I thought, it's interesting in terms of queer hedonism, I guess, and where it stands now.
And I think also, it's really interesting that talking about that sense of hiding and that sense of putting on a facade, sort of, which sometimes you can kind of almost convince yourself to buy into, and for sometimes lengthy periods of time, because you want it to be, you want it to be true. You want it to be easy. You want to be normal.
No idea how good that mic is.
And especially, and so I think it's interesting the idea of having. I mean, you're starting off with like same-sex pairing. I think it's interesting. There might be something to play around with in the idea of having moved away from that facade, from that sort of unreality, in a sense that denial. And now potentially there are these people with certain histories, with those histories of denial and perhaps quite harmful histories of self-denial, self-loathing, whatever.
Everything is exploding.
I'm aware that I would like to just sort of draw attention to the fact that I'm speaking to you in quite a privileged way. I do not want in any way what I'm saying to be sort of misconstrued as somehow pathologising. That is not what I'm saying. I think it's quite important to emphasise that. But I think that there are histories of trauma from which do sort of come from that position. As anyone has histories of trauma from being, bullied or abused or whatever.
We can't read each other. We can't present anything to anyone because all the messages.
But then, particularly in the context of this piece, then you have people who are perhaps sort of being real in a sense, in the way that they're sort of coupled, and then it kind of goes a bit skew-iff. Really, I think that's interesting, and the idea of those sort of 1.5 of those same-sex couplings being presented as being sort of legitimate and authentic at the beginning, and then at the end, although you've got that other half as well, which is potentially.
It's like deep.
Yeah, anyway, sorry, I'm dominating space, but
When I started transitioning,
Do you think the lovers find it hard to find intimacy?
those people on the yard who chat of which there were about 200 people at the time,
Position she's in.
were chatting about
I personally remember it's difficult in the the chasing kind of stage, I guess, of it. But I think it's also, I actually found it difficult in the final bit where there's the waking up, and it's like that's not how it works. You can't just this isn't okay. I felt it didn't feel okay, that it was like to be like going, it's great now. It was like there's too much. I mean, I guess, would I commend someone who can stay that completely open and forward? Maybe, yeah. It's really brave, but I don't know. I found it difficult to stay vulnerable for the idea of Helena still being able to be vulnerable enough with Elizabeth after the whole flip-flopping of treatment of like here that presuming a history before the play starts and then this complete this awful treatment of her, and then
which in itself
and an immediate sort of is
affecting.
Sorry,
which in itself is affecting and traumatic.
Yeah, massively so. That there's like a denial as well of it. It's a scary thing that she's doing. I think Helena, it's frightening to be aware of that and watch it, because it's like
So facing her sense of like self-esteem.
yeah, and because what you were saying earlier was interesting, the infatuation part of it. I don't think I'd necessarily thought of it as just infatuation, not just infatuation. That's a thing, but it feels like it sends it into. Maybe I'm putting this on it, but it feels like that switch in treatment throws it into more of a tailspin than I feel it does. Than I would feel it would if it was Demetrius was still a man. I don't know if that's something I'm putting on it, but I think it's a different. I feel like it's a different. Do I? I don't know. Carrie. There's something that then brings in like shame. The shame aspect and that kind of.
Should we do another card?
Yeah, let's do another card. Yeah.
It's quite interesting as well. I guess I was just thinking as we were talking about it about not only the obsession or infatuation on Helena's part, but it's also spurred on by her jealousy. So, that could really add, to that idea in the first place about are these emotions real? Like, is it really love for Demetrius that she has? Is it?
God, it's a horrible story.
It is, isn't it? But yeah, sometimes the most tragic stuff is the funniest stuff. Sometimes, if you're that way. It's funny.
When you think about it, as a girl, have you ever found yourself being jealous of a guy?
I think in that context, there's a lot. In this context, there's a lot of the competition,
the jealousy is in part because of how Elizabeth feels about Theodore, and it's that like, I think there's. Yeah, I do think in that situation it's a legitimate. I know that because I've
I think completely infatuated with someone who I had a lot of fun with, but they were completely in love with someone else. And yeah, I was jealous as hell. Even though I really liked the other person, I was like, someone I really like. But there is definitely
there's new people.
I think that's
so we were talking about that.
I think it's a different. It's more about that situation rather than
the person.
Yeah.